committee will come to order. I believe the order of business is, who seeks recognition on the legislative? Gentleman from California, I think it's the Democrats' turn. Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report. I think we're waiting.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. Point of order.
Gentleman from Alabama has reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 288 offered by Mr.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from California is recognized for to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle would have us believe that this bill will bring back power to Congress. But in fact, what it really does is give more power to the judiciary and a Supreme Court that has become a partisan institution with a reactionary social agenda, one that has disregarded decades of precedent and denied millions of Americans the right to reproductive freedom, one that has also taken aim at clear water and clear air protections. And one thing that should be absolutely certain, and that is until the Supreme Court adopts an enforceable code of ethics, they should not be entrusted with even more power. My amendment today is very simple. It would allow Mr. Fitzgerald's bill to apply to courts if and when, and only when, all federal courts have adopted an enforceable code of ethics. A code of ethics for the Supreme Court is badly needed, as we've seen with serious allegations of undisclosed gifts and undisclosed travel and undisclosed lodging and undisclosed payments and benefits or compensation received by justices or their families from individuals and law firms with business before the Supreme Court. A code of ethics is absolutely essential. This amendment, which would require that before these kind of changes go into effect, that all federal courts have a code of ethics, is a small step to dealing with a very large problem at the Supreme Court. In fact, I think term limits on the Supreme Court, in which justices, after an appropriate time, would be required to relocate to the Court of Appeals or the District Court, are also an important reform, and I think the court needs to be expanded, given that the court was packed by Mitch McConnell, depriving a Democratic president of an appointment because he said the election was too close, and then in the most jarringly hypocritical fashion, jamming down another appointment during a Republican presidency when people were literally voting for Joe Biden for president. But nevertheless, although those larger steps I think are very necessary, we can begin the process of restoring some confidence in the court by at least insisting on an enforceable code of ethics. No more power for the court until there is accountability. And with that, I would...
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. I'd simply like to point out that the gentleman makes a very good point about the size of the Supreme Court, but there's another reason also. Historically, there's been one Supreme Court justice for every circuit. There are currently 13 circuits, so we're behind the times, and we ought to have 4 more Supreme Court justices for that reason, in addition to the reasons the gentleman expressed.
Reclaiming my time, I think the gentleman, I think, is absolutely right, and you can add to that the extraordinary increase in the caseload that goes before the court if we were just looking at efficiency. But of course, there's so much more at stake with the packing of the current Supreme Court. But in any event, this amendment is about some accountability, some enforcement, some presence even of a code of ethics. If we see nothing else, we've seen, I think, with the current court, the proof that power unrestrained by even a code of ethics can lead to the worst kind of results. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Alabama withdraws his point of order. The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized to speak on the amendment.
It's so interesting that I have to read the Constitution of the United States to the folks on the other side so that they can understand how our government actually works. According to Article 3, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges both of the Supreme and inferior court shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. Section 2, the judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution and the laws of the United States and treaties made or which shall be made under their authority. The courts already have the authority to decide questions of law de novo. In fact, other than when a federal agency is involved in the case, they do it every day. That's their job, whether it is federal courts or state courts. Their job is to decide, is to interpret the law. Marbury versus Madison, we can go back that far as well. The fact is that the Chevron doctrine has stripped the courts of the power to interpret the law. All that the SOPRA does is restore the balance of power and the authority of the courts that existed prior to the Chevron decision. This amendment is not only unnecessary, the accusations being made by the gentleman who has pushed it forward demonstrates the incredible bias on the other side and the attack on our court systems and our courts and our judges, not because they are not interpreting the law or doing what they are required to by the Constitution, but because he disagrees with their decisions.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Yes, I will.
And thank you for reading the Constitution. I particularly appreciate you reading the section on judges and justices serving during good behavior. And so let me ask, if I can, would you consider it to be good behavior to operate without a code of ethics?
I'm going to reclaim my time. If you seek to impeach a justice, you're free to do so, or a judge. That is the mechanism by which you do that.
I'm just asking if it's good
so I'm
behavior
reclaiming my time. This is my
accept
time.
free travel.
Lost
This
to the
is my
gentlelady
time.
from Wyoming.
And there are mechanisms by which all of us can be held to account for our behavior. So if you believe that someone, a judge or a justice, has violated their oath of office, there is a mechanism by which you can address that, and that is called an impeachment proceeding. I believe that there was a gentleman from Louisiana who was a federal district court judge that was in fact impeached many years ago for bribery. And so that is the mechanism by which to do that. Again, the amendment is not only unnecessary, it just reflects the fact that the Democrats are mad that courts rule against their pet projects and what they think that the law should be. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yield to me.
Gentlelady yields to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding it. I think it makes one other point, not only that they're mad, but that just like another famous Democrat many years ago, when they are mad about decisions that they do not like politically, Democrats have demonstrated time and again that they're prepared to fundamentally alter the institution. They will strip down the United States Supreme Court as it has been composed. They want to delegitimize justices on the court who followed all of the rules by allying with people in far-left media and continuing salacious attacks on things that have been entirely compliant with all applicable rules. If they can't if they can't have the political result from the court that they desire, they will destroy the court. That's the way it works. Absolute power is the objective, and anything that stands in the way must give way, no matter how fundamental the attack needs to be. So you hear all sorts of things like a ridiculous argument that we need more justices on the Supreme Court so there'll be one to conform to each circuit court of appeals. How absurd. No, the answer is they're angry, as you say. They're mad at the fact that they haven't been able to secure appointment of the judges and confirmation of the justices they want to the Supreme Court in a few years. Consequently, they must destroy it. I yield back to the gentlelady from Wyoming.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Chairman, it is interesting to hear that the Democrats want to destroy the court because it doesn't agree with us, when the Federalist Society, working with the Republican leadership, has worked for 40 years to pack the courts, all the federal courts, with right-wing judges. So it's interesting to hear that from them. As to impeachment of judges, I think probably Justice Thomas should probably be impeached. I don't know about anybody else. I mean, obviously, he's not going to be impeached by this House, but given what we've seen about his financial transactions, he probably should be impeached, just as Judge Porteous was impeached in 1989. Now, yes, the Supreme Court number has varied from time to time. It has historically been the same as the number of circuits. It ought to be 13 now, but it ought to be 13 also because the court has been packed. The court has been very deliberately packed. We saw this with Mitch McConnell stopping Merrick Garland from even getting a hearing 11 months before a presidential election because the new president ought to be able to have his selection, and then ramming Amy Coney Barrett through after the election before Joe Biden took office to deprive him. This was rank hypocrisy and packing the court. So this has to be undone, and we should not hear lectures about packing the court. And with that, I'll yield to the gentleman from California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I never got an answer to my question from my colleague on the other side of the aisle about whether she considers accepting luxury travel to be consistent with good behavior, particularly when you're accepting luxury travel with someone who has a deep interest in the business of the court. I never got a chance to ask my colleague across the aisle whether she considers to be acting in good behavior if you're accepting luxury accommodations or if you're selling property to lawyers who have business before the court without disclosing it. What about selling property if that property isn't worth what it's being purchased for? I don't know if that's the case, but I think it should be investigated. I'd be happy to yield.
Is it good behavior for the majority leader of the Senate to stand on the steps of the Supreme Court and threaten two sitting justices?
Well, there are remedies which are called...
The yes or no. You pose a number of yes or no questions to us just a little bit later. It's a yes or no question.
Reclaiming my time in the Senate and in the House, we have a code of ethics. But apparently the Republicans don't believe there should be a code of ethics for the Supreme Court. And why? Because the Supreme Court is doing the bidding of the Republicans. It used to be a conservative court, but it's not a conservative court anymore. A conservative court would have some respect for precedent. This court has no respect for precedent. It is a partisan reactionary court, but it's doing your partisan reactionary work, so you don't care who they're selling their property to. You don't care if they have business before the court. You don't care who they're staying with, whose yacht they're on. You don't care about any of that. You don't want a code of ethics for justices who are doing your political dirty work. Well, I do. I don't think it should be a choice between either you impeach them or they can sit on the court and be as corrupt as they want. You know, it's a binary choice. You accept whatever corruption as long as you get the court decisions you want or impeachment. No, they ought to have a code of ethics. Like any other federal officer, there should be some code of ethics. It shouldn't be too much to ask. I mean, do you really think it's right for justices to be doing luxury travel with people with interest before the court and not reporting it? Do you really think that's good behavior?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield for an answer to that question. Do you think that's good behavior?
No, and I think that that's a question perhaps that ought to be asked of Justice Sotomayor and former Justice Breyer, because the evidence against them is in terms of taking money and travel and things like that from people who had, or entities that had cases before the Supreme Court.
My time, then I'm glad to hear you acknowledge. I'm glad to hear you acknowledge that Clarence Thomas was engaged in bad behavior, and so there ought to be some repercussion, don't you think? Shouldn't there be some remedy short of impeachment for judges who engage in bad conduct, for judges who engage in conduct which calls into legitimate question their decisions? I certainly do. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I know the hour is late, and I'm not going to take an unlimited amount of time, but I would like to opine on one thing. As the chairman of the court subcommittee, I would caution that, you know, there has become a pattern of discussion about the court, and I'm seeing it on both sides, that each of them has an example of the high court maybe not meeting current standards that they want to set. They also have the tendency to say, well, they don't like this decision, therefore the court is packed one way or the other. We have the authority, absolute authority, to oversee the court, to work with the court. What we don't have is we don't have the opportunity or the right to interfere with the court. And I would just say that, you know, what I keep hearing more and more, and Mr. Schiff and I came into to Congress together 20 plus years ago, respect for the court then seemed to be something where when we didn't like a case, we'd say they decided it badly. We wouldn't say that it was personally because of some wrongdoing on behalf of the individual. I would strongly suggest to all of us that just as we should not, and hopefully do not, comment on somebody's reason for making a decision that we disagree with, but rather talk about what we disagree on.
Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman yield?
Yes, the ranking member.
Thank you. I want to point out two things. Number one, we're getting a little far afield because we're debating an amendment to apply a code of ethics to the Supreme Court, a code of ethics like the code of ethics that applies to all other federal courts. Second point I want to make is really, I think in some answer to Ms. Hageman, I introduced a bill, as was pointed out a few years ago, to increase the number of Supreme Court justices by 4. Hank Johnson introduced a bill for term limits on Supreme Court justices, and you can do that in spite of the fact that the Constitution says they should hold office during good behavior. It doesn't say which judicial officer. You could take a Supreme Court judge and say you're a circuit court judge. And if you combine the two bills, you'd end up with a system where every president would get 2 appointments during his term, and it wouldn't be the Russian roulette of who dies when. And I'll yield back.
Okay, reclaiming my time, you know, I agree with the gentleman that these are all things that we should consider while recognizing the separation of powers. What I will say about the last Congress, we broke from tradition in the expansion of the court. We were unable to get to the historic bipartisan support for a phased-in expansion of the court. Currently have legislation that will add nearly 80 new members to the court over a multi-congressional period so that no one Senate and possibly no one president would necessarily expand the court.
The gentleman yield?
Just a moment. These are the kinds of things that are our solemn obligation, and we should do it. And I look forward to working with the ranking member, as I did when you and I had the subcommittee together some years ago, because we need to get back to that. I took this time, even though it wasn't directly germane to some of the comments that Mr. Schiff had been making or anyone else, because I believe we've got to get back to a level of decorum. And one of the things is, if we don't like decisions of the court, and all of us do amicus briefs when we feel strongly, let us not suggest that the court is corrupt unless we have real evidence. Let's rather say that the practices of the court, which up until now they've been allowed to determine those, should be reined in. And I look forward to walking across the street at any time with any members on the other side of the aisle to have that discussion with the court about our belief that they should do, as an independent branch, they should do the right thing lest we have to. And with that, I'd yield to my colleague.
I thank the gentleman, and I would just observe things have changed a lot since you and I came to Congress, because you are now the most reasonable sounding Republican on that side of the aisle. And I hope that's not too damning of your reputation. I will say this, I would have never supported expanding the court but for what took place when Mitch McConnell withheld an appointment from one president and rush an appointment for another. That's what changed since you and I got here. When you and I got here, that kind of stratagem, which elevated party and trying to obtain power
gentlemen,
over
my-
the institutional
my-
interests would have never taken place, but it does now. And it has brought
Time of the gentleman has-
disrepute to the court.
Time of
I'm going to have to yield back my time.
Time of the
I thank
gentleman.
the gentleman, yield back.
Has expired. The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
I will.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the chairman. And I thought just a moment ago, what an extraordinary arbiter of what's reasonable. But, you know, I learned in grade school, though, that the court packing plan was what FDR did when he proposed to expand the size of the court, knowing that he dominated Congress, his party dominated Congress, and so since he didn't like the results of the Lochner-era justices, he threatened to grow the court so he could get rid of them without having their opinions evolve, but just add enough justices to outvote them. I didn't make up the term the court packing plan. That's what I learned about in grade school, right?
Would the gentleman yield?
And not until I make this point. One of the things that is so, I made the point, one point just to follow up the point that I made earlier about, it's not just a question about you're mad at the results of a court that construes the law in accordance with what's written, but it is something beyond that, it's a far more radical thing. You're ready to destroy the court, fundamentally change the court, and it actually goes even beyond that. You will change the definition of words. Yep. So when Mitch McConnell, I don't know all the rules of the Senate about it, but because he used his position as the leader of the Senate and the majority to delay a vote in one case, schedule a vote in another, so there was a political outcome in terms of justices being confirmed by ordinary, long-standing existing processes that you didn't like the outcome of because of the way a vote was scheduled in the Senate. Then you've consistently, as long as I've sat on this committee and long I've been watching and listening before that, you've applied the term packing. So the ranking member did it multiple times. I think maybe the gentleman from California also, but you say over and over that Mitch McConnell packed the court. Well, not unless you change the definition of what court packing is. And I guess you can change the court. You can come up, you can delegitimize the court. You can slander and slime justices over issues that are in compliance with the rules and certainly judged by the same standard. Other justices have done the same things. But you can call them criminals. You can talk about them being corrupt. You can imply that they ought to be impeached, even if you don't have enough courage to bring the articles, apparently. But that's not far enough for you. You'll change definition of words. And so, I mean, you do you.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Well,
Maybe you can explain that.
No, I think your recollection, and I'm not saying it's a personal recollection, but your recollection of what Roosevelt tried to do to expand the court is correct, and they did call it court packing. He was unsuccessful. Mitch McConnell tried a different kind of court packing, and he was successful.
Well, but it's not
because his argument.
let me ask you the question. I'll ask you this question. I'll take my time back and ask you because again, you said he packed the court, but do you deny that throughout all American history, until that court packing meant something other than the way you run the Senate to either confirm or not confirm justices and by their processes under their rules? That's not packing, is it?
What was?
I'll yield for that for an answer to that question.
It is absolutely packing when you, in an unprecedented manner, withhold an appointment of one justice, making the argument it was too close to the election, 9 months before the election, and then mere weeks before the election, you jam an appointment down so that you have a Democratic appointment thwarted, a Republican appointment jammed in complete contradiction to the earlier argument. That is packing the court, and the result of those two justices means an entire generation of Americans will live under a reactionary court, but for the fact that he did it.
Well, the gentleman from North Carolina yield to me?
No, I'm going to respond to that. And you can use, you can use any word that you want to and change the definition, but that was about how procedural rules were applied in the Senate. You can disagree with them, but that's how the majority, I mean, I watched, you guys used, under Nancy Pelosi, you used same-day authority forever. You dispensed with the requirement of quorum. You let people stay home in the entire Congress and yet record votes. I don't think any of that made sense, but the way you resolve that is not go fundamentally change the institution of the Congress. It's defeat you in an election and take over and run it the way it should be run. That's not packing. It's not the same thing as fundamentally upending an institution. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition to strike the last word.
Okay, thank you. Gentlelady is recognized. I assume you're yielding to someone. I understand. I understand. I feel for you. I hope that voice clears up. I think you're yielding to Mr. Nadler?
I do yield my time to Ranking Member Nadler.
Okay.
I thank the gentlelady, and I hope her voice heals up too. I'm not, we've had a very interesting debate and excursion into court packing and all of this stuff. I just want to remind people that what we're dealing with is an amendment that really doesn't say much about court packing. All this amendment says is that the
sponsor brought it up, Mr.
I'm not blaming anybody.
Okay.
I just want to remind everybody. Want to remind everybody that what we're talking about, so we can finish this and can debate court packing forever. But I just want to remind everybody what we're talking about is an amendment that simply says that the Supreme Court should be subject to a code of ethics proposed by the Judicial Conference. And they are now not subject to any code of ethics, unlike every federal judge. So I think this makes sense that the Judicial Conference should, which is chaired by the Chief Judge, Chief Justice, should make a code of conduct for the Supreme Court. And I therefore urge adoption of what should be an uncontroversial amendment, all our other digressions aside. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I yield back to her.
Thank you. I now yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from California.
I thank you for yielding, and I'm sorry we're taxing your voice today. And I think my colleague from New York, he's absolutely right. This amendment is about a code of ethics for the court. But I raise the size of the court and the packing of the court for an important reason, and that is because the American people need to know the court has been packed. They need to understand there is more than one way to pack a court. You can pack a court, as Roosevelt tried to do unsuccessfully, or you can pack a court the way McConnell did successfully. There are two justices. The plain fact is there are two justices on the court who shouldn't be there but for the partisan gamesmanship, the institution-debilitating gamesmanship of Mitch McConnell that resulted in Merrick Garland not having a seat on the court and later resulted in Amy Coney Barrett having a seat on the court. Those two appointments wouldn't have happened if Mitch McConnell had allowed Barack Obama, had allowed his nominee to even get a hearing. Now you can say, well, but that's different because the size of the court remained the same. So he packed it without expanding it. Okay, fine. But the effect was exactly the same. And the addition of those two justices will mean, if unaddressed, that millions of Americans have lost their reproductive freedom. And that may be just the first right to disappear. That's the effect of that packing of the court. So whatever you want to call it stacking the court, or you want to call it packing in the court, the result is that an entire generation of Americans are going to see, for the first time in our history, their rights disappear. Their rights constricted, not enlarged.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Did Harry Reid pack the lower courts when he dispensed with the tradition of how confirmations occurred and used the nuclear option to appoint judges to those courts? Did he pack them?
Well, he certainly added justices to the lower courts, but we're talking about a court.
By changing the rule.
Reclaiming my time, we're talking about a court. We're talking about 9 people, the least representative body in the country, that has enormous power over the lives of every single American, that operates without a code of ethics, that can decide to reject decades of precedent, that can decide that today you may have a right over your own body, but tomorrow you don't. Today you may have a right to marry the one you choose, but tomorrow you don't. Today you may have the right to marry someone of another race, and tomorrow you don't. And the effect, the unprecedented effect of with holding an appointment from one president and then in hypocritical fashion jamming another one down the throat of the American people means that an entire generation of Americans are losing their rights.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield.
Thank you. I agree with everything the gentleman has said, but I want to remind everybody that the amendment of the gentleman that we're voting on is to have a code of ethics for the Supreme Court and to do nothing more. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Just real briefly, Mr. Chairman, then I want to yield my remainder of my time to Ms. Hageman, but I heard the ranking member say the number of, quote, the number of justices has historically been the same as the number of circuits. Just want to correct that factual error. It has not been the same since 1929 when the 10th Circuit was created, and prior to that time, it was not the same historically either. In 1801, there were 6 courts, circuit courts, and 6 justices, but between 1801 and 1869, it went from 7 justices in 1807 to 9 to 10 to 7 to 9, never being equal to the number of circuit courts. It was only that case between 1801 and 1807, and then again between 1869 and 1829. So historically, that would not be an accurate statement. I yield the remainder of my time to Ms. Hageman.
I just have 2 questions for Mr. Schiff, and that is that does our code of conduct prohibit us from blatantly lying to the American public, such as claiming to have evidence of Russian collusion when no such evidence ever existed, number 1. And number 2,
will the gentleman
whether
yield?
he agrees that the code of conduct, such as the Hatch Act for federal employees, should be enforced to prevent them from blatantly interfering in elections and colluding with active presidential campaigns.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Yes.
Would you consider a campaign chairman giving internal polling data and battleground strategy to a unit of Russian intelligence while that unit of Russian intelligence is helping your candidate's campaign to be collusion? Or would you consider that just good old-fashioned, dirty Republican politics?
What I remember seeing throughout that entire discussion was blatant lying to the American public on the evidence, the so-called evidence that supported the claims of Russian collusion, which have been
So you think it's just good old,
I am reclaiming my time.
Republican
I am
dirty tricks?
reclaiming my
Time
time.
belongs
The
to the
dirty
gentlelady.
politics only came from one side, and that was the allegations of Russian collusion. And with that, I yield my time back to Mr. Moran.
Would the gentleman yield?
Back to the chairman. I think we've probably gone down this road as far as we need to go.
Would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from California.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. I guess I take the bidding of the ranking member that we should get returned to the amendment, lest we say one thing. There was a discussion about some sort of the need for expanding the court. I would reach out to all my members and suggest that you get on what has historically been the bipartisan expanding of the judges. Having said that, when Mitch McConnell took advantage of the ability to add a judge onto the court, my understanding is it was only possible because decades of tradition had been thrown aside by the other party, and as a result, he was able to do it with 51 votes. We never
Will the
had.
gentleman yield?
It's not my time to yield, but we never had 60 votes. So at the end of the day, the Supreme Court was put back to full because of a policy that your party made, which I personally disagree with. I would like to see a return to the historic filibuster and, as a result, a different process for the court. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition on the amendment from the gentleman from California? No one seeking recognition. The question, the gentleman from California is recognized. Been saying that a lot on this. California. Gentleman from California.
Well, in response to the concerns raised by my colleague from California, just looking through some articles here, the delay in the Consideration of Merrick Garland in 2016 was not unprecedented. The Senate did it to 3 other presidential nominees between 1844 and 1866. Charles Gardner Gay, a law professor at Indiana University, said there's a tendency to view history through rose-colored glasses from time to time, and it suggests we've never been this political, but in reality, we've always had this sort of process. Several times in the 1800s, Gay says, the Senate certainly appears to have delayed with an eye towards saving the nomination for the next president. That is precedent of history, and you know, we ought to pay some attention to it and not try to rewrite it. Yield the rest of my time to my other colleague from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, and I'll be brief. The gentleman very eloquently said that. What I find interesting is the ranking member who said that we should vote on this or opine on it. It's sort of interesting that we're talking about everything else, and what we're talking about, for the most part, doesn't belong to the House of Representatives. It belongs to the Senate. However, the amendment before us does belong to us, and I would respectfully suggest that we move the previous question. Yield back. Oh, I need to yield further to the chairman.
I appreciate it, gentlemen. I am nervous, and I thought what the gentleman from North Carolina put out was right on target. This idea that the left gets to redefine terms is just it's hard to have a real debate when you can just change what things mean. The Senate confirming or not taking up a nominee that the president has submitted, that's not packing the court. That's just following the rules. Packing the court is when you change the rules and say, we're now going to add new justices to the court. That's what packing the court has historically always meant. So I think this is part, though, this committee has seen this over in the last Congress, and now it continues into this Congress, where the left, the Democrats, our colleagues, continue to attack the court. They have threatened the court, so much so that it was the majority leader on the steps of the Supreme Court saying what he said about Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. And of course, we know what happened when the Democrats supported the intimidation that took place at the court when the leaked opinion, the Dobbs leaked opinion, draft opinion, was leaked out. So I hope we defeat this amendment. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from California, and then he can yield.
Would the gentleman from California yield?
The gentleman from California yields to the ranking member.
Thank you. Without getting into this debate about who packed the court and when and so forth and so on, I want to remind everybody that this is interesting, but it is not the amendment before us. The amendment before us says that the Judicial Conference of the United States, chaired by the Chief Justice, shall propose a code of conduct for the Supreme Court. They're the only court in the United States that doesn't have a code of conduct. They control the Judicial Conference, and all this amendment says is they should vote themselves a code of conduct. So I hope everybody can agree on that. I yield back.
The gentleman's point is well taken. It's
Yep.
just that I think history is so important that we shouldn't tend to rewrite it to suit our needs.
But we should support this amendment.
Well, I think the amendment on its face has some separation of power concerns, because it basically says something that Congress is going to pass can't actually become law until some other body takes some action, namely the Judicial Conference. That's probably a concern, a fundamental concern about separation of powers and the power we have as a separate and equal branch of government. So putting aside the packing the court argument that the sponsor of the amendment brought up, that we've had now for a while, and that the ranking member says we should move on from, there is just the problem with the amendment, what the plain language of the amendment says. I do think it's probably got a separation of power concern there when it says something Congress passed can't take effect until some other judicial body, the Judicial Conference, takes some action. That's probably a real concern, and I think problematic for this, and another reason why we should oppose the amendment. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from California. Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield to the gentleman from California.
I thank the gentleman. You know, I just pose a question to the chairman. I appreciate you raising separation of powers concerns. I don't think they're implicated here. But I'm curious, Mr. Chairman, do you support a code of ethics for the Supreme Court?
I think the court has always maintained its ethical standards run through the Chief Justice. I think that's what should continue to happen.
And so Is this because you have more confidence in 9 people with the power that they have? They don't need a code of ethics, but members of Congress do, because they're operating on a higher moral plane or something? I don't understand. Why do we have a code of ethics, but the court doesn't need one? Can you explain that?
If the court wants to impose a code of ethics on themselves, like Congress has done to us, that's fine. But I leave that in the hands of the highest court in the land. I think that's consistent with the Constitution, as Ms. Hageman referenced earlier, and that resides with the Chief Justice of our
Would the
Supreme
gentleman
Court.
yield? Would the gentleman yield?
In just one moment, I have to
second?
yield, but you know, there are few bodies with the kind of really almost absolute power of the court within its domain. And really, Mr. Chairman, you think with all the power the Supreme Court has, we should leave it completely up to them whether they want to feel they have to abide by any code of ethics. Just going to leave it up to them. And if they want to become secretly beholden to very wealthy people with interests before the court, if they want to do that, well, then we're just content with that. We're content to leave it to them and just hope for the best. Is that where you're coming from, Mr. Chairman?
I gave you my answer.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield.
I just want to point out that, contrary to the chairman, we impose the code of ethics on ourselves. We impose the code of ethics on all federal judges other than the Supreme Court judges, and we can, by the same power, impose the code of ethics on the Supreme Court, though this amendment doesn't have us do it. It delegates that authority to the Judicial Conference. I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. I mean, clearly, I struck a nerve here by pointing out the way in which the Senate Republican leader has packed the court, and I understand why that strikes a nerve. But let me tell you something. It may be offensive to Republicans on this committee to consider that court packing, but what is debilitating to the rest of the country is they've lost their reproductive freedom because of that packing. Because without it, millions of Americans would have control over their bodies that don't have it now. So you can say, well, we don't like the connotation that this was packing the court, because there's only one way to pack the court, and that is by expanding it. That's your view. But no, I think for millions of people that just lost their rights, they think there's clearly more than one way to pack the court, and you did it, and you did it. And the only question, I think, for the rest of us is whether we're prepared to do anything about it. Because the alternative is that for the next 30 years, we're going to have a reactionary court with a reactionary agenda, disregarding decades of precedent. That's the reality that millions of Americans are going to face if we do nothing about it. And if we can't even take the baby step here today of imposing a code of ethics, or at least not enlarging the court's power until there is a code of ethics, so we can't even take that step. And Mr. Nadler's exactly right. This step is even one step shy of imposing code of ethics, just saying, let's not expand the court's power until they have some ethical code. And that's even too much. But I guess when they're doing your political work, then no ethical code is necessary. I mean, we've seen that time and time again with the last administration, that as long as the last administration was furthering a reactionary agenda, no ethical code was necessary for the former president, and no ethical code is necessary for the current court. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The that's right.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
I'm going to strike the last word. I actually do not take, and agree the notion with gentleman from California that Supreme Court can take rights, because Supreme Court cannot give us any rights. All rights are provided by our Constitution and the people. And if the people believe that some rights needs to be in the Constitution, we have a process for constitutional amendments. We have this legislative branch that can legislate. But courts shouldn't be given or taken rights. It's interpret the Constitution. And if it is interpreted incorrectly, the courts can reinterpret that. But if we believe that the rights should be given, they should be explicitly stated in the Constitution, and we have a process to do constitutional amendments. If a gentleman doesn't like it, he should work on this process. If American people believe in to have given more rights and protection, they should be constitutional, like we have a Second Amendment rights, which actually under attack. But I also believe, we do not have this high moral ground to decide what is ethical or not. There are some transparency things that courts should recuse themselves. It already exists. There is financial disclosure. We can do it. But each branch should decide what code of ethics needs to be there. And our branch is infringing on other branches' rights and separation of power if we decide what kind of code of ethics they need to have. We follow our code of ethics, they need to decide, but there are some requirements could be. But we have no right to tell other branch what kind of codes they should have, and there is infringement on the separation of power, which is extremely important. So I completely disagree with this notion and debate here, and we have a process. If you disagree what courts does, we can override it, because American people have that ability. And it actually was done on purpose to make sure that we do not misinterpret and change our Constitution, because if we become a country with each government, the Constitution is changed. We create instability, and we'll start reminding third world country where each government comes and start interpreting the laws in a different way. So I think we have a very important institution. I think there is a lot of politics about packing, not packing, but it is very dangerous to go and set the precedent that we are going to start changing the number of justices, we're going to start changing the rules because we don't like. Elections have consequences, and elections have results. But ultimately, when you have justices, which actually originalists, they interpret Constitution how it's written. And a lot of times, even my conservative friends don't agree with that. But I think we do have a lot of good justices there that truly believe in the limited government and the rule of law, and believe their functions is, to interpret Constitution. And sometimes it doesn't land what Republicans like. So I would not say that the court is political. I actually think we have a lot of justices that me as a common sense person and not an attorney, but when I read in the opinion, I actually agree with a lot of that. So I think it's really the right thing to do, for us to respect the other branches, whether we agree or not, and deal with the work we should do as our branch. And I truly believe we also don't do enough work to oversee executive branch, pass budget, pass legislation, and have accountability regardless who's in charge, Republican and Democrat, because I think our branch lost their relevance and has a very low approval rating because we're not doing our job. And the power of a purse is one of the most significant power that's given to this branch, and we cannot even pass budgets, and we cannot even, hold other ones branch accountable. I think maybe we should concentrate on our job instead of, criticizing some other branch and try to use a political messaging, which we're unhealthy, and puts a lot of necessary pressure on justices there, and really put their lives at risk, because we politicize in Supreme Court, and this is really something that differentiates the republic from pure democracy, which leads a lot to dictatorship, and we have to keep this republic strong. It's very important, because this is the last stronghold that we have around the world, and maybe we can have more productive debates on real issues, not really doing politics. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Oh, gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
This will be, it's late, and this will be real quick, and it's supposed to be a little humorous. I don't know if it will be, but my first thought is this is definitely not germane. My second thought is we are not packing the court, and that's never what packing meant. But the humorous part of it to me is, this is, as a lot of my dental friends would say, when you get a lot of lawyers in one room at one time, this is what happens.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. The clerk will call the roll.
Those in favor.
Yeah, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. The noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that,
Roll call is requested. The the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Isa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? No. Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, you are not recorded. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Nels votes no.
Are any other members not recorded who wish to vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 15 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there further discussion on the,
Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes the ranking
I
member.
have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. Gentleman from Arizona reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 288 offered by Mr. Nadler of New York. Page 1, line 9, insert after extent necessary the following, quote, and except as otherwise provided in this section, unquote. Page 2, line 4, strike.
The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from New York is recognized. Speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would exempt rules made by the Food and Drug Administration pertaining to consumer safety from the heightened judicial review requirements of this legislation. As we have noted, this bill would eliminate judicial deference, empowering activist courts to substitute their policy preferences for the specialized expertise of federal agencies. Ultimately, it would bring the agency rulemaking process to a halt, incentivizing judges to rewrite current regulations and introducing uncertainty into the effort to make new ones. In the more specific context of the FDA, it would hinder the agency's efforts to protect American consumers. Every year, 1 in every 6 people, roughly 48 million people, suffer from foodborne illness. Of these, more than 100,000 Americans are hospitalized and 3,000 people die. My amendment would preserve the ability of the FDA to react quickly to sudden crises in food or drug safety, saving lives and money in the process. It would preserve the ability of the agency to define dangerous levels of toxins and to protect our drinking water. And it recognizes the importance of the role that the FDA serves and the expertise they provide on a daily basis to protect the health and well-being of our constituents. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman insist? Gentleman from Arizona withdraws his point of order. I oppose this amendment. First, SOPRA is not deregulatory. Congress and agencies remain free to regulate matters affecting public health and safety. Second, SOPRA does not change the standard of review for questions of fact. Courts will not be second-guessing agencies' factual findings about public health and safety issues. Third, all questions of law should be reviewed under the same standard, de novo review. That is what courts are there for, and they are good at it. There is no reason to subject the legal decisions of certain agencies to a less exacting standard of review, exempting some agencies from SOPR would put their legal judgments ahead of the courts and goes against the constitutional separation of powers. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and yield back. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call being requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Nagoose? Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, you are not recorded. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Moore, you're not recorded. Mr. Moore votes no.
All members voted. Clerk will tally and report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 15 noes.
The amendment is not agreed upon. The question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on reporting the bill. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. A reporting quorum being present, the question is now on favorably reporting the bill as amended. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Roll call, please.
Roll call being requested, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Issa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes yes. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes yes. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes yes. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes aye. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes no. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Nagoose? Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
No.
Mr. Ivy votes no.
Has anyone not voted? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 15 ayes and 5 noes.
The bill is favorably reported, will be favorably reported. The House members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. I believe this concludes the business of today's markup and committee hearing. With that, we stand adjourned.